Let me welcome you to the second of 4 lectures dealing with techniques in determining the age, race, and sex of the human skeleton. If you remember in the first lecture, we talked about determining the age of the individual at the time of death. Today we're going to be talking about the sex of the individual, how you determine whether the skeleton is a male or a man or a woman. Let's go back just a minute and review some of the techniques that we used in the first lecture. If you remember in talking about the age of the skeleton, you can literally look at any part of the body depending on how old the individual is. For example, if you have a subadult individual, a person say below 18 to 20 years of age, you can look at 2 major criteria: the eruption of the teeth and the closure of the epiphyses. Now, if you have an adult skeleton, what you want to do is to begin to look at the degenerative changes of the body. The changes that occur, for example, in the pubic symphysis, the changes that occur in the internal structure of the bone, what is known as osteone counting, and then as you get later on in life, the degenerative changes of the skeleton, which can best be seen by what is known as osteoarthritis, or a buildup of bone around a joint surface. I don't know how many of you have ever taken a course in anthropology, but I think that all of you have noted that women have broader hips than do males. If you have not noticed this, go notice it. It's an exciting experiment, and you can do it in the name of science. Now, the best area then to tell the sex of an individual is from the pelvis. When in doubt, always look at the pelvis. Sometimes you don't have the pelvis, and we'll talk about other means of determining sex in this lecture, but let's start with the area that gives us the best results in determining whether a person is a man or a woman. Let's go now to a model of the pelvis. We have here a model of a human pelvis, and your pelvis is made up of 3 different bones. It is made up of the sacrum, which is the bone at the base of the spinal cord. It is made up of 2 hip bones, the right hip bone, or what is known as the right innominate, and the left hip bone, or the left innominate, and you can see here the top of the femurs that are articulated with the innominate bone. Now let's go to, before we get into a more specific discussion of the anatomy of this, let's go back and give you separate pieces of the skeleton to show you how the pelvis is put together. All of you know that the spinal cord is that part of the skeleton which connects your skull to the rest of the postcranial skeleton. This is a spinal column. Remember that the top 7 vertebrae are known as cervical vertebrae. These are the ones that are in the neck. The next 12 are the ones to which the ribs attach, and these are known as the thoracic vertebrae. And then the bottom 5 are known as lumbar vertebrae. These are the ones at the base of the spinal column, and you will note that they are larger in size than are either the thoracic or the cervical vertebrae. The reason for this is that as you go down in the body, it needs to support more weight, and therefore the heavier bones are at the bottom. Now, the spinal column ends in what is known as the sacrum, and this is a separate sacrum, and you can see how the sacrum fits on the bottom of the spinal column right there. Let me get it so it fits a little bit better there. There we go. Now you can see how the sacrum. Now the sacrum acts as a weight distributor. It essentially distributes weight from one column, which is a spinal column, out into 2 columns, which would be both legs. And therefore, the sacrum then distributes weight into the right innominate and the left innominate. Now let's get a separate innominate. Here we have a left innominate bone, and you can see how the sacrum fits in to the pelvis right there. And in this case, we have skeletal material that is of different color. You see that the sacrum is whiter in color. That is because it has been bleached. And the right innominate or hip bone here is one from an archaeological site, and it has dirt down in the bone, and we didn't get all the dirt out of it. But essentially, where the white bone and the dark bone articulate means to join, where they join or articulate is the sacroiliac joint. Now, let's take this bone right here and talk a little bit about this. And up until about puberty, if you remember back again on aging, when the epiphyses were uniting. One of the things that we need to remember is that there are other things occurring in the aging process other than just the closure of the epiphyses, and one of those is the closure of three bones, the ilium, the ischium, and the pubis, in order to make a separate innominate bone. Early in life, or say up to puberty, say 13 to 16 years of age, this bone is in three different parts. Now reach down by your side where your belt would be, right here, and under your belt you will be able to feel a bone. Go ahead and feel it. It's there. Okay, what you're feeling is the crest of the ilium. This is this bone right here. And you're feeling the iliac crest, or the crest of the bone that is known as the ilium. Now, take your bottom and wiggle it a little bit on the chair, and you will find that you're sitting on two bones. You're sitting on your ischium. You might have thought you're sitting on something else, but in all honesty, you're sitting on your ischium, and if this is not there, you're just a blob of tissue oozing off of the chair, because this is what is holding you up. Now, you can't feel this while you're sitting down, but when you think about this later on, note this bone here that I'm pointing to. This is the pubic portion of the bone. This is the third part of the innominate bone. We have the ilium. I'm holding this with the ischium and pointing to the pubic bone. When you get out of this lecture, if you want to try this, punch in on your tummy, and about 4 inches below your navel, you're going to run into a bone, and that will be the pubic bone. Remember, we talked about the pubic symphysis and the pubic symphysis in the aging process. This is the pubic symphysis, which is the face of the pubic bone that we talked about and showed you illustrations in the last lecture. What we want to do now is to take the same bone that we talked about in the aging process, and we want to begin to show you the differences that occur between males and females. Essentially what happens is this. A female has a broader pelvis because she gets width in the pelvis in three different areas of the innominate bone. Now let's go and get two innominates here. What we have is an innominate of a male and an innominate of a female. Now what I'd like to call your attention to is the length of the pubic bone in a male is short, and the length of the pubic bone in a female is long. Note that the length of the pubic bone in the male is a short pubic bone, and that the length of the pubic bone in the female is long. You can look at this another way, by the way, by, if you have an innominate bone, by taking your finger and putting it against the pubic symphysis, and note that my thumb is right against the bone. Note that I cannot wiggle my thumb in this male pelvis. A male has a short pubic bone. Now let's try the same thing in the female. Put that down and get the female bone, and you will note there that the female has a long pubic bone, and note that my thumb does not even touch the bone. In other words, one of the areas where a female gets width in the pelvis is a longer pubic portion of the bone, and therefore a wider subpubic angle. Now let's go to a second criteria that we would like to show you. In the female, again trying to get width in the pelvis, this notch here in the bone between the ischium, which I'm holding it, and the ilium up here, this notch in the bone is known as the sciatic notch. Now note in a female, if I put my thumb in the sciatic notch, that I can wiggle my finger from side to side. In other words, a female has a broad sciatic notch. Now let's look now at the same structure in the male, and you will note that a male has a narrow notch. Note when I put my thumb in the notch in the male that I cannot wiggle my finger from side to side, or my thumb, and therefore you have a narrow notch, and this is very characteristic of males. Now let's look at the third area where you get differences between a female and a male in the pelvic area. We want to look now at the sacroiliac joint. Remember again, we had the sacrum. Let's get the sacrum back so you'll remember this. Where the white bone and the brown bone come together, that is the sacroiliac joint. This joint surface right down through here. Now, this is the surface that you want to look at for the third of the criteria we're going to use. And let's hold the bone in this direction so that you can see across it. And I want to show you that you can take a pencil or a probe and you can run it across the sacroiliac joint in a male. In other words, there is a very flat surface between the sacrum and the innominate in the male. Now let's look at that same structure in the female, and you will see that there's a buildup of bone in the sacroiliac joint in a female. And if we go back to the same position that we had it before, where you're looking essentially across the sacroiliac joint right here, note that I cannot get my probe across the sacroiliac articulation because of a buildup of bone in the sacroiliac joint. What this is doing essentially is pushing the innominates further apart so that you are getting width in the pelvis. In summary now, the difference between a male pelvis and a female pelvis is essentially in the width that occurs. A female has a longer pubic bone. A female has a wider sciatic notch. And a female has a buildup of bone in the sacroiliac articulation, which is right there. This is what causes a female to have broader hips. Now I'm going to walk over here in just a minute and show you some differences that occur between the way males and females stand. And so if you're ever on a stakeout trying to watch people getting out of town or something like this, and you see some of these characteristics, you'll understand what is happening. And if there's somebody dressed up in clothing of the opposite sex, you can understand what these differences are going to be. Let's show you how an innominate fits on to the pelvis. There is the head of the femur, and note that the head of the femur fits into what is called the acetabulum, which is that hole right there. You can see how the head of the femur fits into the acetabulum, and when you walk, this moves, as you can see right there. Now, let's move over and let me show you the difference between how males and how females stand. Note that as I stand, I am locking both knees in place. If you were to watch a female stand, you would note that she would kick one leg out of place. Now the reason for this is that a female having a broader pelvis, in a male, the innominate hangs roughly straight down below the hip bone like this. Now, if you broaden the innominate, or broaden the pelvis, note that I'm broadening the pelvis, note that the femur has to incline at a greater angle under the innominate bone. Again, this is the way it is in the male, and note that as I broaden the hip, the femur inclines at a greater angle under the innominate bone. If it didn't, if in a male, if you broaden the hip like this, then women will walk around like this, and you can see that there is a difference here. Let me show you a couple of things that you need to be watchful for, particularly if you're ever on a stakeout, watching people at a bus station, a train station, or an airport, and somebody trying to leave town masquerading in the clothing of the opposite sex. We just talked about how individuals stand, and let me show you another characteristic about a carrying angle. If you've noticed, males carry their books down on their side like this. If you watch females, females carry their books up like this. Now, the difference is because of the width of the pelvis. If females carried their books down on the side, their books would be way out here on the side like this, and this would be uncomfortable. So what they do is they compensate for this by bending their arm and carrying their books up like this. If any of you are ever on a stakeout, watching people, if you find a female, or let me say it another way, if you find a male who is standing with one leg out of, bent and holding books like this, you need to check this out more carefully, because what I think you may have is somebody who is dressed up as a male. In other words, you would have a female dressed up as a male trying to get out of town without you noticing who they are. Now, these are things that we can change clothing, but these are anatomical features that are very difficult to cover up. Okay, in summary now, the best area to tell the sex of an individual is from the pelvis. Now, the second best area to tell the sex of an individual is from the skull. And let's go now and look at some of the skulls that we have. And let me introduce you to this individual. This is a Negro woman. This was a human identification case that came in about 25 years ago through the Kansas Bureau of Investigation. And this individual was shot in the chest and buried in a shallow grave. And when we identified her, the family did not want to bury this individual, so we kept her in the anatomical collection. Now, I don't know where you all have gone to neck. All of you are taking this course come from all over the United States, and so you could be anywhere. But a little biological determinism. Remember how you used to go out and rub your girlfriend's head and so forth like this? A little biological determinism there, because females have a nice, smooth, gracile skull. It's like caressing a Georgia peach, you know. It's exciting. If you think back, by the way, let's go get a male skull here. If you think back, the girls didn't run their fingers through your hair very much. This, by the way, isn't a male. This is a Mongoloid individual, basically the same as American Indians, Japanese, or Chinese. And if you remember, the girls didn't run their fingers through your hair very much. The reason is because males have a lumpy and bumpy skull. What we're looking at in a male are heavy supraorbital ridges. These ridges across the eye orbits. Note also that males have a large mastoid process. This is the area back of the ear being right here. This is the mastoid process, is larger in males than it is in females. Note the muscle markings on the back of the skull. This is where the muscles of the neck attach, and of course the larger the muscles you have, the larger are the foundations, the foundation being the bones, and so you have ridges on the bones. So that males have a larger skull, a more rugged skull, larger mastoid processes, heavy supraorbital ridges. Now something that's going to be a little more difficult to show, but let's see if we can. If you will take a skull and feel the upper edge of the eye orbit. Now you can't feel this on yourself because there's tissue there and your eyeball's in the way. But if you have a skull, if you will feel the upper edge of the eye orbit, in a male that will be a blunt surface. In a female it will be a sharp surface. You will have a sharp, almost a knife edge along the upper edge of the eye orbit. That's not a bad criteria, by the way, and it's something that you can take a look at. Now, let me show you another criteria. Let's go to get both skulls here. This will be then a male here and a female here, and you will note there that, contrary to popular opinion, a female has a smaller mouth than does a male. Or saying it positively, a male, which is this one, has a larger mouth than does the female, which is this one. Now let's go to a criteria which is pretty good for telling the sex of a skull, of looking at the mandibles. Let me put these two skulls down, and we will go to the mandible, or what is known as the lower jaw. And a very good criteria that I found works fairly well. We're going to hold these mandibles. This is the way the jaw is. And you hold the mandible up like this so that you can look at the chin. And note that a male has a square chin. A male has a chin that comes to a point in a square. And note that a female has a point, or a chin that comes to a point in the midline with a point. And I think that you can see that pretty well, where a female has a pointed chin and the male has a square chin there. And that is a characteristic that I think that you will find occurring in many of the skeletons that you may come across in your criminal investigation. All right? The second best area to tell the sex of a skeleton is from the skull. Best area is the pelvis. Second best area is the skull. Now, let me introduce you to a big term known as sexual dimorphism, which is a fancy term which simply means that males are larger than are females. The reason for this is that females reach puberty 2 years sooner than do boys. If you who are females remember when you were in the 6th or 7th grade, you were beginning to reach puberty, or there were some other girls in the class reaching puberty, and you were beginning to worry, but it wasn't going to happen to you, and finally you reached puberty. And you then were interested in the 8th and 9th grade boys. You weren't interested in the 6th or 7th grade boys because they were out there going like this. They were playing cops and robbers. And you notice that some of them have never gotten out of that stage of playing cops and robbers. But essentially, what's happened is girls reach puberty 2 years sooner than do boys. Remember from the aging lecture that we had, when you reach puberty, there's a rapid growth, and growth stops when the epiphyses unite to the diaphysis. This occurs in females 2 years sooner than it does in boys. Boys reach puberty, but they reach puberty 2 years later than do girls. Therefore, boys grow 2 years longer than do girls, and they end up then, in general, taller than do girls. Now let me show you a characteristic or criteria that we can use to show this. This is, by the way, not the best criteria to use because there's still some growth occurring in this bone. If you remember the epiphysis that is separated here, there's still some growth occurring in that bone. But if I set these two bones together like that on the table, you will note that the one on your right is larger than the one on your left. All other things being equal, this is a male and this is a female. But you have to be careful because sexual dimorphism is something that is not always as good as it could be. As you know, there are some large females and there are some small males. If they died and you buried them in the same grave, using size differences, or again what is known as sexual dimorphism, you could get these things mixed up. But let me show you a criteria that does work. Let's go and look at the head, close-up of the head of these two bones. Look at the head of the femur, and you will note that the head of the femur here is larger than the head of the femur here. All other things being equal, if you measure the maximum diameter of the head, if it is 43 millimeters or less, this would be this one. If it's 43 millimeters or less, it is a female. If it is 45 millimeters or greater, it is then a male. Now, you may wonder what happens if it's 44, and indeed, an awful lot of them are. What you've got to do is to look at other criteria. Essentially, though, one of the best ways of sorting out sexual dimorphism or size difference is not only looking at the size of the bones, but measuring the maximum diameter of the head of the femur, and this will give you some indication of whether the individual was a male or a female. Now, let's summarize what we have just talked about and on how you determine the sex of a human skeleton. Whereas in age, you can look at any part of the skeleton, depending on how old the individual is. In sex, the best area to look at is the pelvis. If you don't have the pelvis, you're somewhat hard put. Let me say, by the way, that there are 208 bones in the adult human skeleton. When I first started working in law enforcement 30-some years ago, one of the questions that police often ask is, how many bones do you want us to bring in? It's very much like a puzzle with 208 pieces in that puzzle, and that puzzle is a picture of a scene. Let's say it's a scene of a log cabin along a lake in the mountains. If I give you one piece of that picture and ask you, what is that picture? It's going to be much more difficult for you to tell me that than if I gave you all 208 pieces of that skeleton. So, if you have a skeleton, every bone is important. You want to bring in every bone that you can, because you want to look at all parts of the skeleton to see if these things are occurring. The things that we've talked about in the aging and in determining the sex. If you give me the entire skeleton of 208 bones, we in anthropology can determine roughly about 96% accuracy of 100 skeletons, or saying it another way, that we can determine sex in about 96% of the individuals. There are about 4% of the population, people like Christine Jurgensen or Renee Richards, which fall in that overlap between the morphological or anatomical features between the male and the female, and it is difficult to determine. I had a case one time from Easton, Pennsylvania. A hunter was out hunting, and the dog stopped to sniff a skeleton, and or to sniff something. The hunter went over, and it was a skeleton. They called the state police. The state police called a mortician. The mortuary brought in the bones. Dr. Krogman, who's the man I got my doctoral degree from, looked at the material, and I was a graduate student at that time. He let me look at it. This is how we did these things. We both looked at them. He made his decision, I made my decision, and then we talked about why we were correct, and more specifically, why we differed in a case. And in this particular case, both of us would have testified in court that this individual was a male, except for one thing. The individual was 5 months pregnant at the time of death. Now here was a skeleton that had all of the criteria of a male, but because there was a fetus in the abdominal cavity, about a 5-month-old fetus, you know it could not have been a male. So there are some individuals that overlap. And these things are not 100%. You should be aware of that. However, remember that in about 96% of the cases, we can determine the sex of an individual. The best area, again, in the summary of sex, the best area to determine sex is from the pelvis. Look at the length of the pubic bone, look at the width of the sciatic notch, and by the way of the criteria that we talked about, the width of the sciatic notch is not the best. I have seen in skeletons wide sciatic notches in males, although I have never seen a real narrow sciatic notch in a woman. But I think you can get wide sciatic notches not only in females but in males. Also look at the buildup of bone along the sacroiliac articulation. Going to the skull, you're looking at a lot of things. You're looking at essentially the robusticity of the skull. Is the skull gracile or small and smooth and delicate? It would be a female. If it's more robust, if it's more rugged, if it has heavy supraorbital ridges, if it has heavy muscle markings, it is a male. Look at the chin. If the chin comes to a point in the midline, it's a female. If it is a square chin, then it is a male. And then you can look at any of the other long bones. Taking the bones and looking at them, you can determine whether if it is a large individual, it is very possibly a male. If it is a small individual, it is very possibly a woman. The reason for this is what is known as sexual dimorphism, where you have males growing 2 years longer than women, and therefore, in general, males end up larger than, or girls, or boys end up larger than girls. And you can look at the diameter of the head of the femur, and this is an indication, again, of size, but size is not the best. Remember that the best area to tell the sex of an individual is from the pelvis. Thank you very much for being with us with this lecture on how to determine the sex of a human skeleton. Thank you.